we're discussing, it's very important to place the effectiveness agenda into the larger picture of the development, larger development agenda. We all know that the GPEDC came out of the Busan discussions in 2011, and GPEDC was endorsed officially in 2012 in Paris. You may remember the meeting at the UNESCO headquarters. There's a fun story about this. At some point, CPD, at that time we were just a CSO delegation, decided to leave the room. And actually that generated some reactions from the official delegates. But nevertheless, at that time the GPEDC was officially launched, and CSOs came together. And CPD was officially launched, I think, a few months later, because we had a transition process. You may recall that before CPD, we had a Better Aid platform, and we also had the Open Forum platform. The Open Forum was specifically about CSO's effectiveness. And the Open Forum was really the platform behind the Istanbul principles and the CMREP framework. So extremely important effort by CSOs. And the two efforts, Better Aid, Open Forum, came together. So by placing the effectiveness platform into the larger context, I would like to refer to the financing for development agenda. Well, financing for development agenda in this case is really something referring to the UN discussions on financing for development. And my reference here is more specifically to the Monterrey conference on FFD in 2002. And I would like to argue that the initial elements of the effectiveness agenda were kind of discussed, planted into that context. If you go back to the Monterrey conference final document, you will find references to the effectiveness agenda. So, and with this reference in mind, we can quickly jump to the endorsement of the Millennium Development Goals. So we have to place the effectiveness agenda into this larger context. Obviously, we can go farther back in time, we can go back to the conferences in the 90s, but for now let's focus on the past 2 decades and a little bit more than that. So my point is that we should be linking this effort about effectiveness to the larger picture of financing for development. Let me add that by doing so, we are able to link this agenda to the larger picture of financing for development. So we can rightly claim that effectiveness is not just about ODA, which is one specific kind of finance, but it's also about any other kind of financial flow, and I would say even any other kind of development / financing for development policy. This kind of relationship between the effectiveness agenda and the general financing for development agenda became clear throughout the years till we got to the point of the Busan Declaration. So this is a very nice picture of how things have evolved over time. So from 2002 is not in that slide, possibly we might want to include Mexico into that picture. And so that the first building block of this official effectiveness agenda was the conference that took place in Italy in 2003. It was an initial step really looking to very specific areas of donors working together, more about donors coordination. Then things quickly evolved. The Paris agenda on effectiveness, and with the principles as we know them right now, and with something also more than the principles as we know them now. I'm going to get back to this point later. And Accra, I would stop here a little bit more than I did with the other two countries. Accra in Ghana, that was the third conference. And why I think it's extremely important, because at that conference, CSOs managed to get to a point where the role of CSOs as development actors was officially recognized. I would say that we do not need any official recognition because we know that we are development actors. But getting to a point where donors are officially recognizing CSOs as an independent actor of their own right, or in their own right, sorry, the English language here is not clear to me. Anyway, development actors was extremely important, and it had implications then. So, and the international community then moved quickly to the Busan conference. Busan conference was a turning point in many ways, and exactly in Busan, the international community moved to something different from just mere aid effectiveness. It moved to the notion of development cooperation effectiveness around four basic principles that you are very familiar with: ownership, inclusive partnerships, transparency, accountability, and focus on results. So these are the current four principles that we are all referring to. In Paris, there were other elements. I would like to recall that in Paris, for instance, fragmentation was a significant area of work that unfortunately got lost when it was a shift from Paris to Busan. The Busan Declaration itself is a very interesting, complex document. So in that Busan Declaration, we do find principles, but there are also other commitments. For instance, just after stating the importance of ownership, country ownership, the Busan Declaration states the importance of participation and democratic ownership. So this is to say that whenever we refer to democratic ownership, we refer to something that has been officially endorsed in Busan. So it's not CSO language anymore, or just that. It's more than that. The development generally moved to the Busan Declaration, the four principles, the democratic ownership principle, and even the Istanbul principles have been officially recognized in the Busan Declaration. So the Istanbul principles were created, drafted by CSOs by themselves, and they were endorsed in Istanbul in 2010. Then the Busan Declaration in 2011 officially recognized these principles. And this is another important step that speaks to the fact that CSOs have been influential, have been able to reassert their independent role and to get this recognition fully captured in an official document such as the Busan Declaration. As I've said briefly earlier, from Busan, then the old system moved to the GPEDC and to the current system. Exactly, this is the slide actually speaking about this change from Paris to Busan, so we can skip this one. And these are the fundamentals about the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation. When it comes to this slide, I would like just to recall a few basic facts. This is a multi-stakeholder partnership. Within CSOs, there are different views on multi-stakeholder partnerships or multi-stakeholderism. It's a very difficult word. From a CPD angle, generally speaking, multi-stakeholder is good in our experience. because in the case of the GPDC, multi-stakeholderism translates into the fact that CSOs are directly involved in the governance of GPDC on equal footing with the other stakeholders. We have a seat on the steering committee of the GPDC, and CPD is playing that role as the CSO constituency caretaker. And over the years, this level of participation of CSOs has further evolved to the point where we have now one of the co-chairs coming from the CSO ranks, Vitalis Meja. So this is, in my view, one of the few official large platforms in the development sector where CSOs are sitting on equal footing. Obviously, power balances are extremely telling, different. So we're not claiming that in terms of power relationships we are equal to the others. But in terms of the official processes, decision making, we are there on equal footing. This has implications, obviously, because there are effectiveness commitments about CSOs. We have the CSO's effectiveness principles, Istanbul principles. So the GPDC is expecting CSOs to implement these principles. And so let's not forget that we are not in the GPDC just as watchdogs, but we have a stake and we have responsibilities. This is a very effective picture that tells about, and through very nice flags, about the GPEDC developments over the past 10 years. Yes, 10 years have just gone by since the Busan conference. So these are the main milestones. So GPEDC held 3 major high-level meetings: Mexico, Nairobi, and now Geneva, and a senior level meeting in 2019 in New York. Obviously, Mexico City was possibly one of the most energizing moment for those who were there, because it was the first GPEDC meeting, so there was still a lot of energy in the conference room. Let's not forget that one of the big concerns that Busan did try to address was about the lack of progress in terms of the implementation of the Paris principles. And one of the operational response to this issue, the lack of progress, was let's create moments to get the political leaders involved. And so the idea of holding high-level meetings every 2 years. And Mexico City was one of those moments where we still managed to have a lot of political leaderships, political leaders in the room, definitely. We had a Mexico declaration reasserting, obviously, the importance of the Busan principles. And it was the first time the GPC discussed findings from a survey about implementation of the Busan principles. So it was the time we discussed the first comprehensive global progress report on the implementation of the effectiveness principles. Obviously, at that time, there was a limited number of countries that were involved in the monitoring process. The amount of financial resources captured through the monitoring process was limited, but definitely that was a high moment. The second high-level meeting took place in Nairobi according to the regional schedule every 2 years. But that was, in my view, the moment where things started changing to the current setup. The idea of involving political leaders was not working, and this is one of the big lessons that we need to reflect on, whether or not GPEDC has been successful in generating the kind of political traction that was supposed to generate. And so in Nairobi, some decisions were taken that then affected the governance of GPEDC, and then affected GPEDC ability to generate data. For instance, high-level meetings moved from a 2-year event to a 4-year event, and when it comes to the monitoring process, at that time it was still the idea that the monitoring process has to be biannual, every 2 years, but things start evolving. And this kind of change became very clear in 2019 with the New York senior level meeting. And from that point on, the most dramatic changes within the GPEDC were about the monitoring process. So, and for several years, GPEDC went through a reflection process to change the monitoring framework, and this is what we are discussing today. Geneva was the point where the new monitoring framework was officially endorsed. But it's not just that. I would suggest, if you had time, to go back to the Geneva Summit declaration. CSOs were directly involved in Geneva, as was the case with the previous summits. CSOs were involved in the drafting of the final document, and I would say that we managed to reassert some fundamental facts, starting with the importance of the principles from Busan, because some players really wanted to change these principles, but we said this is not a time to change the principles. And we asserted the integrity, not just the importance of the effectiveness, but the integrity of the agenda. So it's not just about one element. All the 4 principles are equally important and must be addressed together. And when it comes to the reporting structure and framework, the Geneva outcome document comes with very specific commitments. I would just to read a few lines from the Geneva Summit outcome that really speaks to this element. So this is official language. The new monitoring framework, what we measure, retains existing measurements, including those which track progress on the Paris Declaration on aid effectiveness, and thus promotes transparency and accountability among all stakeholders at the country level. So this is, to me, extremely important, because despite the changes to the monitoring framework, the international community, GPEDC more specifically, committed to keep measuring progress and implementation of the principles that were endorsed in Paris more than 10 years before. So there is this kind of continuity from Paris to Busan to Geneva that is extremely important to safeguard. So in Geneva, the new monitoring framework was officially endorsed, and a new monitoring round officially started in 2023 following decisions in Geneva. So that's where we stand now, and that's why we are in this room. Well, these are the 4 effectiveness principles. I understand you're really familiar with these principles. And so now we are going to have a very quick overview of some of the implications that we might want to consider when we talk about effectiveness agenda. This is reflecting some of the things we just discussed about the general political scenario that we need to consider when working on the effectiveness agenda. For instance, we should be noting that there is plenty of references to the effectiveness agenda still today. For instance, I can note that at the most recent meeting of the OECD DAC, the body that actually is responsible for setting the reporting rules on ODA, this very recent high-level meeting, OECD DAC, that took place in November this year, if you have a look at the outcome document, there's plenty of references to the effectiveness agenda. To the extent that you can be very surprised, because you can claim from that document that effectiveness is so important, but then you raise your concerns about why are they not funding the implementation of the effectiveness agenda if they're claiming that it's so important. But if you go to any official document, this slide actually refers to the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, to the 2030 Agenda. You will find references to the effectiveness agendas in various shapes, because the principle that countries should lead on their development has been officially recognized in many ways. To us, this seems to be so obvious that countries should be leading on their development. But, you know, to get these principles into the official UN and other donors' statements has been a struggle, has been a fight. For instance, if you go to the Addis agenda, Addis Action Agenda, there is Chapter 9 that's actually specifically about the role of countries and their leadership on their development processes. And these are just a few of the very practical opportunities that we may have. For instance, the INFF, the Integrated National Financing Framework, this is something that CPD works on and actually and this is, the INFFs are coming directly from the Addis Ababa agenda, and they are supposed to be the companion to the development plans at country level, a companion in terms of providing the finance to support implementation of development / SDGs plans at country level. And one of the key principles behind these INFFs is that they must be led, driven directly by countries, and to the point that now at this point these frameworks are no longer referred to as a menu of options, but rather as an approach in a way that is absolutely in line with not just country priorities, but also countries' systems. And I would also say that even the case of high-level political forum or the voluntary national reviews, all these UN processes are largely imbued with this idea of country ownership. And not just that, also about the role of the different stakeholders should have in securing development at the country level. We're coming to an end, and this is about the legacy from the Geneva summit. I guess that together with Matt we can look into the different areas. I will not. I'm going to leave the program, GPEDC working program, to you. Within the legacy from the Geneva summit, obviously there is this GPEDC monitoring exercise. And the thematic initiatives, again, I guess, Matt, you can expand on the CSO thematic initiative you're following so closely. I think I can stop here. We're going to look into more into the GPEDC monitoring exercise in greater detail later. But from here, you can understand that this monitoring exercise is a multi-year process. So it's not just 1 year, but it's a process that is going to cover more years. and it's supposed to be wrapped up in 2026. But we're going to have more time to look into this. Let me see if there's another slide. Well, this is a general picture that is still about how GPEDC is now working, and it's time to stop for me. Thank you so much. I hope that it was clear enough. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Luca, for giving us the overview and sort of setting the foundation for our training. Just to say that last slide, the previous one, we'll focus almost exclusively on the 4MR, with some later you will see built into the GPEDC's work program is something called action dialogues, or delivering at country level, and that's really that's really embedded in the monitoring framework. In fact, the monitoring framework is really the basis for all of the GPEDC's work at this point. Even these thematic initiatives, which are supposed to be linked to the Geneva outcomes and the past effectiveness commitments, are all very much tied in with the GPEDC monitoring. And that goes for the one that Luca has mentioned, which is this thematic initiative on CSO enabling environment, which we'll get to in detail later today and then very much tomorrow. Just to give some background, though, on the previous year's progress reports, the official progress reports, and what we've done, and basically what kind of gives us our, not say motivation, but orients us towards the new 4MR, learning from our past experience. In 2019, if we had resources, we would probably go about doing something similar. But in 2019, we prepared a report that essentially was a parallel monitoring report of the official monitoring framework, and that produced a set of recommendations. A set of findings first. Next to the official findings and the official data, and then some recommendations directly linked to those findings. So we're just going to walk you through those. This is background. It's a long document, but it's actually not very heavy to get through. It's quite easy to read, I would say. So in the past monitoring round, like as I said, in 2019, they did the third round of the effectiveness monitoring. And we had already started trying to engage in this, but not as systematically as it's being set up now. In our engagement, we learned, let's say, 9 things and have 10 recommendations based on those 9 things. So the first one is basically the overarching finding is the importance of advancing inclusive partnerships as a whole, and that doesn't only link to the monitoring, but that links to the whole developmental process, but the planning, the monitoring of it, the actually delivery of it, etc. So recognizing CSOs as development actors in their own right, but also as watchdogs, and basically understanding the diversity of the role that CSOs play. What the report showed at the time, both the official report and CPD's monitoring report, was that there's actually been really sort of modest or not very good progress on this idea of inclusive partnerships for development, which is one of the effectiveness principles. Essentially, that the recommendation coming out of this is that the global partnership needs to drive this and demonstrate its commitment at a country level to strengthen the conditions that partnerships can flourish. So that's obviously linked to the enabling environment for civil society, but not only. I mean, Lucas flashed this slide earlier about the various different constituencies that are involved beyond government to government. So making sure that actual partnerships can happen on equal footing. The second finding of our third monitoring round progress report, parallel progress report, was that essentially the inclusions of CSOs specifically in the development planning process speaks to the implementation of the ownership principle and what we had advocated for, which was democratic country ownership. So CSOs sort of trying to represent the people's needs, including this perspective in the development planning process, is especially important. So what that means is, at a recommendation level, is that there needs to be institutionalized processes for CSO dialogue on policy and implementation, not only for development cooperation, but the broader development agenda. So this links obviously to the financing for development agenda, the SDGs agenda, and whatever you might have in terms of your own frameworks at country level. So really linking into those so that it becomes, let's say, not just access, but good access that allows for, proper engagement. Third point, this one we all know well, the enabling environment for civil society is very important. First, to allow CSOs to act as development actors, but also, and this one often gets lost in the issue of CSOs' own development effectiveness, there needs to be enabling conditions for CSOs to be effective and deliver on those commitments that we've made to the rest of the sort of actors in the development community. This one, obviously, progress in 2019 was not great. It was actually bad in many places. And it's probably only worsened since COVID and all the things that we experienced or know that has happened throughout the post-COVID period, et cetera. So back then we had, and still to this day, we have 3 recommendations related to this, which is essentially a renewed commitment, and this is embedded within the thematic initiative, but a renewed commitment to enabling civil society with urgent and concerted action, especially in terms of safeguarding the legal and regulatory frameworks that allow for CSOs to contribute. And we saw a lot of, I think this is where we saw a lot of stripping away of those legal and regulatory frameworks through the period of COVID under the guise of, let's say, pandemic prevention and so on. The second recommendation related to this, directly related to human rights defenders needing sort of specific safeguarding to be able to carry out their activities. That is quite a specific recommendation, I should say. And the third recommendation linked to this is, again, around CSO own effectiveness and basically recommitting, civil society committing to fulfilling its own obligations linked to Istanbul principles, which I think we've been reviewing in the past work program for CPD and how to improve the implementation of the Istanbul principles. I think Luca has actually led a little bit of research on CSO's effectiveness, especially in terms of dynamics, let's say, in partnerships and so on. Fourth finding, transparency and access to information is hugely important. This is let's say at a global level, let's say at a regulatory level, it seems to be improving, but it's not really on sort of a practicable level. I think access to information is been relatively stagnant, let's say from 2019. So the recommendation obviously is more or less to institute more deliberate measures and better systems for information access, including support to the actors at country level to be able to use that information. So there's a whole capacity development angle of it, and I think this goes a little bit hand in hand with the monitoring itself and of the GPEDC needing to embed that into its work in terms of being able to support good engagement through understanding of the monitoring framework itself. Mutual accountability, I guess this would be number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, fifth finding, mutual accountability for development outcomes. The recommendation being that there needs to be improve the institutionalization of mutual accountability mechanisms across the full spectrum of development cooperation. So that's accountability by donors and partner country governments, and I guess we could say other development actors. I think we would particularly focus on the private sector, but there's others. Gender equality and women's empowerment. What we found in the 2019 monitoring framework is that there are major gaps still in terms at country level in addressing this issue, and it's evidenced in the indicator on gender and gender budgeting within the effectiveness monitoring. So obviously the recommendation is committing to gender-specific initiatives, increasing support for women's rights or women's organizations, and mainstreaming gender equality across donor programs and partner country sort of planning processes. Couple more, sorry, I'll try to wrap this up quick. Effective public expenditure for financial management systems. This is the PFM. This is actually the area where I think governments are most interested. And it's one of the areas that's probably lagging the most in terms of the implementation of the effectiveness commitments. With, in 2019, only 37% of countries have improved the use of PFM systems. So that's using countries' own systems for implementation of development or deployment of development cooperation, et cetera, and monitoring of it. Action needed to improve public access to fiscal information, procurement policies and practices, and then the external audits of government's finances. So and this is where parliaments play a particularly important role in terms of overseeing budget allocations and reviewing and looking at these things through public process, public hearings, et cetera. So that's the recommendation. And then the last part is on tied aid. And this is something that has really sort of regressed or retrogressed, I think, since the original commitment. We see donors tying aid a lot more than they had in the past through different sort of tricky accounting. Well, I guess not tricky accounting, but creating new types of vehicles for how they deploy development cooperation, and essentially it amounts to tied aid. So happy that indicator, which was at risk of disappearing, I felt like at some point because donors don't like it or development partners don't like it, is still there. And well, there needs to be there basically need to be fully accountable for the aid that is tied and continue to commit to untying further their aid. So that basically is where the conclusions we drew from the third monitoring round as a synthesis. And these, I think, it's good to know this just in terms of how we approach the fourth monitoring round. Obviously, country contexts could be totally in line with this, or there could be some diversions or divergences, I should say. But yeah, it's good to have this overview of these were the main, let's say, overall findings of our aggregate, our aggregate findings of the monitoring process in 2018, 2019. And it's good as a marker in time of where we were, and now we'll see how things have evolved, developed, improved, or worsened this time in 2023 and 2024.